Your lecturer is Dorsey Armstrong. Dr. Armstrong is a professor of English and medieval literature at Purdue University. She is a recipient of the Charles B. Murphy Outstanding Undergraduate Teaching Award, Purdue's top undergraduate teaching honor.
Welcome to this lecture series on the year 1215. Buckle your seatbelts because you're in for a wild ride. Over the next 24 lectures, we will travel around the globe, and there will be something for everyone. Theological dispute, family strife, the rise and fall of empires, bloodshed, bad kings, rebellious nobles, new inventions. We've got all of this and more coming your way. And make no mistake, amazing things happened all over the world in 1215. The drafting of the Magna Carta in England and its reluctant acceptance by King John arguably sowed the seeds that would ripen centuries later into the U.S. legal system. The great Mongol leader Genghis Khan captured the city of Beijing in a stunning and cunning display of military strategy and daring that dramatically reshaped the entire continent of Asia, with the impact of that event felt down to the present day. And the Fourth Lateran Council would dictate everything to the Christian faithful, from what they should believe to how they should demonstrate that belief, in a serious reworking of religious doctrine that reverberated throughout Europe and beyond, affecting Christians and non-Christians, and having dramatic ramifications for all segments of society. In some cases, we'll focus on actual singular events that happened that year, like the drafting of the Magna Carta, or the meeting of the Fourth Lateran Council, or the Mongol conquest of Beijing. In other cases, we'll talk about general trends or developments that kind of swirled around or near the year 1215. For example, we'll discuss the status of crusading, which was in a critical stage in the early 13th century, or the rise to power of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe in Africa, or the flowering of Pueblo culture in the Americas. Similarly, we'll talk about how treatment of Jews, persecution of non-mainstream Christians called Cathars, and the status of women in the medieval West was changing right around this time. We'll also examine literary trends that were starting to flower in Europe right at the end of the 12th and beginning of the 13th century. Additionally, 1215 is right smack dab in the middle of what has come to be called the Golden Age of Islam, and we'll look at some of the amazing contributions to medicine, science, philosophy, and other fields from the Islamic world. In Japan, society at this time was becoming more and more controlled by a class called the samurai. These are just a few of the highlights of the lectures ahead, and I should make a disclaimer here. My main area of expertise is medieval Europe. Although we will visit some peoples and places outside this region, the majority of the lectures in this series will draw on my main strengths and interests as a researcher. But here's the thing. If you're a teaching company customer, you know as well as I do that learning doesn't stop when you get out of college. And even though I'm a college professor with a specialty in medieval literature, ever since I received my PhD a long, long time ago, I've spent a good chunk of my time continuing to learn, and not just about the Middle Ages in Western Europe. I always say my job is the best job in the world because there's always a chance to learn more. If you are a college professor and you say you are bored, that is your own fault. While in this lecture series I'm keeping somewhat close to my strengths, I've had an excuse to expand my knowledge in certain areas. For example, up until now, while I've been familiar with key moments in Mongol history, I've pretty much engaged and encountered the Mongols from a medieval European point of view, which, as you might imagine, was always something like, savages, death and destruction, God has sent them to punish us, they don't have any sense of personal hygiene, and they wear their clothes until they rot off their bodies. With this series, I was given the opportunity to restart my research, but from a new angle, which has led me to conclude that Genghis Khan was an amazing human being. We're talking maybe the earth is lucky to see his like once every couple of thousand years. And what's more, the person most responsible for his success is arguably his mother, who, given the nature of Mongol society, shouldn't have survived nor been able to save her young children when she was widowed. As you'll see, Mongol society under Genghis Khan was both utterly transformed from what it had been, and under Genghis Khan, it would utterly transform and reshape the world around the Mongolian homeland. It didn't feel right to me to spend time on medieval Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, particularly the area around what is today China, and completely neglect the Americas and Africa. So, on our tour of 1215, we will make a brief stop in each of these places. Not enough to do them justice, but enough, I hope, to whet your appetite and send you looking for more information on those places and their societies. But as far as Antarctica and Australia, I got nothing, just penguins and kangaroos. It doesn't mean that absolutely nothing was happening there, although I suspect that might be true of Antarctica. But these areas are so far outside the realm of my expertise, I hope you'll forgive my neglect of them. And of course, before we can start talking about the year 1215, we have to acknowledge a few things about how we have decided that it is, in fact, the year 1215. The first thing is, we're calculating this date based on the conventions of the Gregorian calendar, which was introduced into the European world by the Pope at the end of the 16th century, and today is the most widely used international calendar. This way of keeping track of time replaced the Julian calendar, which had been introduced in the 1st century BC by the Roman Empire. But because of a miscalculation in that calendar, the seasons had fallen out of sync with the actual calendar. This was particularly a problem for the Church when it came to calculating the date of Easter, which, if you've ever studied anything about the Middle Ages, you know is always a problem because it has to be calculated according to a lunar calendar, and equinoxes matter, and blah, blah, blah. Thousands of church leaders spent hours and hours trying to figure out when Easter should be. And they had fights about it, and they called great synods to dispute the matter, and I could go on, but you might fall asleep. What's important to know here is that when 1215 happened, it was happening according to the Julian calendar. And the differences between the two are such that when it was decided to accept the Gregorian calendar, the date of October 4th, 1582, was followed the next day by October 15th, 1582. So as you can imagine, this can prove to be a headache for historians, as if you're going to be really precise, you need to be sure the date you're looking at is rendered either in OS, or Old System, or NS, New System. And then you have to try and adjust from one to the other. Additionally, not everyone celebrated the New Year at the same time, even if they followed the Western calendar. In many places, the New Year was judged to start at Easter, which makes sense in a Christian community. But that means that sometimes when we read that an event happened in February 1102, it would have been, by our reckoning, 1103 already. Other people felt that the New Year should begin on the anniversary of Jesus' birth. So someone who followed this system of dating might think that the calendar had changed on December 25th. By this measure, we would think of December 31st as, say, still 1134, while someone who calculated this way would think it was already 1135. Still others believed that the new year should be marked by the Feast of the Annunciation, so the day that the Virgin Mary found out she was pregnant with Jesus, as this marked the real beginning of the Christian era on earth. By this reckoning, what we would call January 12th, 982 would be January 12th, 981 in the minds of those who chose to count backward 9 months from Jesus' birth to mark the start of the new year. And of course, while we're talking about the year 1215 in a calendar that is familiar to most of you taking this course, many of the peoples we're discussing did not use that calendar. In the Islamic world, it was actually 611 or 612, depending on what part of the year we're talking about. According to the Hebrew calendar, it was 4975 or 4976. In Japan, the year was Kenpo 3. The Mongols followed a lunar calendar very similar to what the Chinese use today, and in any event, paid more attention to the animal. Was it the year of the horse, the rat? Than they did to the actual date. And of course, timekeeping was different throughout the Americas and Africa, with each region or kingdom or people measuring time in different ways. So what I'm saying is, we need to be sure and be aware from the outset that we know when we pick the year 1215 to investigate, we're starting from a position that takes the Gregorian calendar as its foundation and the conventions of the Western world as a starting point. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I mean, it would be hard to market a course called the year 1215/611/3/20 summers past the last big drought in the Southwest, but it's always good to be cognizant of the vantage point from which one begins a study or investigation. And also, we need for a moment to think about why 1215? While those of us who work on historical periods use markers like dates for convenience, any scholar worth her salt would never argue for a stunning overnight cultural and social change. For example, although we usually say the medieval European period lasts from 500 to 1500, that does not mean that on January 1st, 1500, or Christmas or Annunciation or whatever, everyone stopped being medieval and suddenly started being Renaissance. Nor does it mean that the ideals of the Roman Empire were checked out and completely forgotten on New Year's Eve 499. Yet we've picked 1215 because many world-changing events did occur during that year. The impact of some were felt immediately. The impact of others would take decades to be recognized. And in some cases, the impact is still felt today. Because so much happened around the world that year, it's also useful to take a kind of snapshot of the people, events, and movements that were occurring roughly equivalent with the early 13th century. Such a view shows us both how different things were back then, and also how in some cases, some things are still the same. So now that we've got the preliminaries out of the way, let's talk about what was going on before 1215. In particular, I want to focus on something that started to happen around the year 1000, and which would eventually lead indirectly to several of the events we're going to discuss in this lecture series. Specifically, I'm talking about the world climate, which over a period of about 300 years or so got warmer on average by a couple of degrees. Now, this might not sound like enough to make a difference, but in the grand scheme of things, as we're learning today, a change of just a degree or two can precipitate other changes that dramatically impact society and which can then create a cascade effect with other changes following quickly behind. Although technically it probably began in the mid-10th century and ended sometime in the 14th, this period we're focusing on, called by climatologists and archaeologists the Little Optimum or medieval warm period, had its most strongly felt effects in the 11th and 12th centuries, the exact period of time leading up to the year 1215. From the vantage point of the long view of history, it would seem that these things were most likely interconnected, but not in any ways that might be immediately obvious to the casual observer. So let's start with the year 1000 and step back and take a good look at the medieval world in Europe. What did it look like? Well, for one thing, it was a mostly rural agrarian society. 90 to 95% of the people living in the medieval world at the turn of the first millennium were dependent in some way on subsistence farming. And what this meant was that the margin between bounty and starvation was painfully razor thin. If one year a frost came late, or the rains were unexpectedly heavy, or the summer was too cool or too hot, then the crops failed and people didn't eat. Archaeologists examining skeletons from this period see clear evidence of malnutrition by today's standards, and evidence also of backbreaking labor. There was trade, of course, but there were no large urban centers, as there had been during the Roman Empire. There was a cash economy, but most transactions were conducted through the barter system. The population of Europe was somewhere around 35 million or so, and most people lived in small hamlets surrounded by agricultural fields, on the margins of which were thousands and thousands of acres of forest. It was said that you could travel from France to Poland during this time and never see daylight. So heavily wooded was such a large portion of the countryside. 300 years later, the population would have reached around 80 million. Cities like London, Paris, and Rome were booming in terms of trade. The forests had diminished significantly, and a large portion of the population made a living at various trades, many of which had nothing to do with subsistence farming. This warming was devastating in some places, like the Sahara in Africa and the southern portions of North America and parts of South America. But in medieval Europe and the far north of the Americas heading toward the Arctic Circle, well, it was an incredible blessing. Suddenly, the growing season was longer, more temperate, and crops failed less often than they had previously. Suddenly, there was, generally speaking, not only enough food to go around, but also some left over. Those who were subsistence farmers were better nourished. Those for whom they worked, usually a lord on whose manor they lived, were wealthier in cash because they could trade the surplus for goods and money. Trade increased. If you have extra wheat, you don't want to sell it to your next door neighbor. After all, they probably have plenty of wheat themselves. But you might find an eager buyer a few hundred or so miles away in a place where it was difficult to farm wheat, but easier to produce, say, linen or beeswax or wine. So when people had more of whatever it is they had worked to produce, they started to look farther and farther away, because that was where you could get the best price for your product, where it was scarce, rather than where it was plentiful. Now, we should note that the little optimum did not mean that there was pleasant weather all the time over this long time span. There were certainly a fair number of hard winters, late springs, early frosts, and other challenging climatic effects. But on the whole, the weather was optimum most of the time for an agricultural society. The simple fact of the more plentiful, regular harvests produced, as I suggested earlier, a cascade effect. Suddenly, with better nutrition, more children lived through the dangerous periods of infancy and childhood, surviving to become adults who in turn reproduced, and the cycle repeated. The population began to grow, and as it grew, what had been a pretty stable ratio of land to people began to shift, as there were more people who needed and wanted land to work. Starting in the 11th century, we see, first of all, the claiming of all available land that was, to this point, uninhabited or unclaimed. Many pieces of land that were open but had previously been unavailable for farming. The soils were too dense or clayey, or the region was too wet and marshy to support farming. Suddenly, these spots became the catalyst for creative solutions to agricultural problems. Now, once all the available land had been claimed, the population turned its eyes to the forests, which, as I indicated earlier, occupied a significant portion of the medieval landscape. Through a process known as assarting, medieval peasants began to bring forest land under the plow, which was both difficult and time-consuming. But with the increase in assarting and decrease in the amount of forest land that was available for use in this way, we see the first real signs that this warming trend might not be all that great in the long run. For now, with less forest available, rulers tightened controls over it even more. And this created a larger class of truly destitute people. In the past, they might have managed to eke out an existence in their home communities as beggars. Because medieval society was largely stable with not so many people moving about, beggars were often well-known members of a community. In other words, the people living in a particular hamlet knew the family of a beggar and what circumstances had brought him to this low position, and beggars were also regarded as serving an important function in that they supplied the opportunity for people to demonstrate Christian charity. Most beggars could also rely on help from the local parish church. With so many stories about corrupt clergy coming down to us from the medieval period, it is important to remember that the church was often the greatest force for good in the Middle Ages, especially in small communities where the lives of clergy and secular townspeople were deeply interwoven. But with the surplus food supply, there now existed another place beggars could go: the city. This was a place of great opportunity for many, but it also had its negatives, as the very, very poor were now cut loose from the social networks in smaller hamlets of which they had been an intrinsic part for so long. But the lure of the cities was hard for many to ignore, especially as there was an increase in urbanization during this period as trade flourished. Trade in goods like wine, as warmer weather was producing some delicious wines from the area that we now think of as France, and trade in wine became a going concern. Like a boulder rolling downhill, the changes in the medieval European world due to increased crop production began to build faster and faster, each one, it seemed, more dramatic than the last. Soon, cities were places of possibility for prosperity, where merchants could make money and rise to an economic status that had only been available to nobles before this. But if urban centers attracted those who were rising in society, it also attracted those who were at the bottom of the order. Urban centers became full of beggars, people who either had no place else to go, especially with the disappearance of the forests, and they turned to the cities in a last desperate attempt to survive. Gambling, prostitution, thievery, medieval cities were rife with them. So, we have a growing population, a diminishing forest land, and a burgeoning urban scene. But there was more. The change in climate apparently led to a huge increase in sea fish populations, particularly herring and cod. In places where fishing yields had been moderate at best, suddenly there were large schools of fish, ready to be netted, packed in barrels of brine, and transported and sold throughout the medieval world. And what we have to remember here is that the medieval diet was notoriously low in protein for the majority of the population. Most people survived on cereal grains converted into some kind of bread, along with dairy products. Fruit and vegetables were seasonal, but the type and variety you could get depended on what would grow where you lived. But with the increase in cod stocks, a sudden appearance of a plentiful source of protein, this period marks the first significant phase of sea fishing and trade. Encouraged by the success of netting large numbers of cod and herring, more and more people turned to the sea. And when they did this, they were motivated out of necessity to get better at sailing on water. As you might guess by now, the period leading up to 1215 thus heralded significant advances in shipbuilding and navigation. And not everyone out adventuring on the high seas at this time was looking for fish. Plenty were looking for land. With warmer temperatures, scientists have described how, on occasion, the sea would have experienced a phenomenon whereby the waters became very still and glassy. In other words, great for sailing across. Medieval seafarers now felt inclined to venture further than they had before. One of these was a man called Erik Thorvaldsson, whom most of us know today by the name of Erik the Red. Erik and a group of followers traveled west at the end of the 10th century. They established the first European settlement in Greenland. Erik's son, Leifr, or Leif Erikson, journeyed to North America sometime around the year 1000. He established a settlement in what is today Newfoundland, and for a time, regular trade and travel existed between North America and Iceland. Of particular interest were the grapes that Leif and his men brought back from a region that he named Vinland, after the fact that it was full of wild grape vines. The accounts of the sagas are clear about this, and this is yet another indicator of how the climate must have changed at this time if there were grapes growing wild so far north. So in the run-up to 1215, we have a repeating cycle of higher food yields, which led to better nutrition, which led to an increase in population, which led to the development of technologies designed to get even more food from the land and sea, which again led to an increase in population, which finally produced a situation in the 13th century, right around 1215, in which the needs of the population outstripped the ability of the land to sustain that population. This resulted in those people that could trying to maintain ever tighter control over the resources that were available to them, which in turn may have produced the kind of mentality that led to what has been called the rise of a persecuting society. Certain groups on the margins of society, lepers, homosexuals, heretics, pagans, Jews, women, and others, were stripped of their rights and properties. So there was now more in the way of resources for those who were in the mainstream of the medieval world. Now, while the Little Optimum was producing generally improved living and crop production conditions for those in medieval Europe and those to the north and west of this area, in other parts of the world, it was having a disastrous effect. Portions of the American Southwest, for example, underwent such sustained drought conditions that native communities that had been established for hundreds, and in some cases thousands of years, were forced to relocate long distances in search of a reliable water source. And just to the east of the medieval world, on the Eurasian steppes, a group of nomadic peoples known as the Mongols were finding their ages-old way of life threatened by the change in climate. Unable to rely on the patterns of seasonal migration that had long sustained them, they turned their gaze toward the west. And in one of those historical moments in which we have the right person in the right place at the right time to effect a significant shift, this climate change and period of necessity and crisis was occurring at exactly the moment that a man named Genghis Khan came to power. Most of you have probably heard the name of Genghis Khan, and while you may not know the details, you probably associate that name with horses, brutal warfare, and the image of the horde. Indeed, Genghis Khan's followers were known as the Golden Horde, and when they were forced to move out of their grassland home because of climate change, the horde moved en masse at the behest of the great Khan himself. As we'll discuss in several lectures later on, he and his followers and descendants conquered several cities in Asia, destroyed the famed irrigation systems of Iraq beyond repair, and thus helped usher in a new, more austere and severe brand of Islam among those who survived his depredations. At its height, Genghis Khan's empire was the largest single political entity ever to exist on the planet Earth. Shortly before he died, Genghis Khan reportedly told his sons, quote, "With heaven's aid, I have conquered for you a huge empire, but my life is too short to achieve the conquest of the world. That task is left for you." End quote. Around the middle of the 13th century, his heirs continued to push west into modern-day Russia, Poland, and Hungary. But then, the climate began to change again. Rains returned to the steppes, and life in the ancestral homeland of the Mongols became easier. Anthropologist Brian Fagan contends that this is what saved Europe from further incursions from the Mongols. If the weather had not suddenly become more conducive to life on the steppes, he points out that the Mongols would have continued to push west. We even know what the plan of attack would have been. First, invade Austria and destroy Vienna. Next, go on to Germany and then south to Italy. Once those territories were secure, the plan was to continue west into France and Spain. As Fagan says, the possibilities of paths not taken here are fascinating for historians and scientists to consider. He says, quote, "Would Europe have become a Muslim continent? Or would the Mongols, who were tolerant of other beliefs, have left the Catholic Church alone? Had the conquest taken hold, would there have been incentives for European explorers and merchants to find new ways to tap the riches of Asia by opening new seaways across the Atlantic and round the Cape of Good Hope to India, where they could have land routes across a unified empire? Had the climatic pendulum not swung back, there would have been no incentive to return home to a drought-ridden, arid land." But the weather did indeed change, and it started to change at exactly the moment when history hung in the balance and Genghis Khan's grandson, Batu Khan, was deciding whether he would keep moving west or reestablish himself on the Eurasian steppes. He chose the latter, and the stream of history chose to flow into one riverbed rather than another. As we'll see in the lectures that follow, the period right around 1215 is fascinating for a number of reasons. One, because things beyond human control had been changing the climate, landscape, and population for over 200 years at this point. Two, because in this period, several events that had long been brewing or developing came to a head. And three, in response to those events, other singular stunning processes would be set in motion. In our final lecture, we'll see what fruit those events bore years, decades, and even centuries later. But for now, let's return to 1215 and one of the most important events to take place that year, the creation of the document known as the Magna Carta.